Welcome back to the continuation of day 34 and 35. That was 3 to 4 videos ago, and this is the final piece. So essentially, in those videos, I insinuated that if an emotion stays longer than 90 seconds within the body, it becomes a habit, and then repeated habits become character, and then you live with that character long enough, then it becomes your destiny. That might have been just a simplified version, and we all know that it's much more nuanced than that. So if we are unable to process our emotions in a healthy manner, and we aren't able to release it, it becomes a quiet dictator running in the background that shape our habits and eventually life outcomes. Today we are answering the question, how does unprocessed emotions become a pattern? When emotions aren't processed, our brain stores the pattern. If an emotion isn't acknowledged or resolved, the brain doesn't simply erase it. Instead, it stores the memory of the experience along with the emotional reaction. Two important brain systems are involved. First, it's the amygdala. It tags the experience with emotional significance. And there's the hippocampus, which stores the memory as context. If similar situations happen again, the brain will immediately retrieve that emotional pattern. And over time, someone might not consciously remember the original experience, just the reaction pattern that remains active. In this case, we always talk about subconscious this, subconscious that. But what people call subconscious is mostly automatic processing. So, I'm sure you've heard people say when something gets buried in the subconscious, what people usually mean is that it's a process that operates outside of our conscious awareness. Here are some examples that I can include. Automatic emotional reactions, learned expectations about relationships, defensive habits like avoidance, people pleasing, distrust. So these patterns become implicit memory, meaning they influence behavior even when the person isn't consciously thinking about them. Here's how repetition of those reactions turn into habits. So if the same emotional reaction keeps getting triggered and practiced, the brain strengthens that pathway. So this is basic neuroplasticity. It's the brain, when the brain gets efficient at repeating what it's practicing, then over time the sequence could look like this. Over time the sequence might look like this. Somebody experienced an emotional event. It opens a wound. Or it's the same experience happening again in their life from an earlier stage, or and then a habitual reaction develops. It's either they withdraw, they attack, they avoid, or they people please. This reaction then becomes automatic, and then our decisions start forming around that reaction pattern. So at that point, the person starts to believe, this is just who I am, this is how relationship works, and this is what life is like. This is an example that I can think about. This is from what I just observed from a friend. So when they were growing up, her dad left, and when her dad left, that was her first lesson in thinking that the people that you love will always leave. Now, living with her mom, getting into romantic relationships, and then witnessing her getting left behind by multiple partners over and over and over, plus the parent telling them, this is just how relationships are. People you love will leave. You fall in love with them, you give them everything, and they leave. And then growing up, as that belief becomes implicit memory. And so when they try to get into a relationship, they start to remember, oh, I'm just not gonna do it because I'm always gonna be left behind. Or they do get into the relation, or they do get into a relationship and then expect to be left behind because they probably believe this is just how relationship works. You know, like, those are just a few examples of the beliefs that communicate, and these are just one of the many beliefs that hold somebody back. Some of them might think that their poor reaction to a certain situation is just who they are, or every time they fail in life or an opportunity gets taken away from them, they start to believe that, oh, this is what life is like. Repeated happenings in one's life and repeated reactions become a pattern that helps them form beliefs, which also leads to them creating an emotional script, whether learned or them arriving on their own by themselves. Since all of those stem from reaction patterns that were repeated over and over, its consistency is now classified as a habit which can influence character. So, in psychology, personality and character are partly shaped by consistent behavior patterns. So, let's say, if someone repeatedly reacts to life from the same emotional lens, those reactions become predictable traits. Here's an example. Somebody who's always so distrustful can become a cynic. Somebody who's always avoiding hard conversations, commitment, emotions, vulnerability, can become a passive participant of life. And somebody who has resentment that they feel over and over with an active emotional loop that's alive and well, it can turn into bitterness. So, yes, unaddressed emotional patterns can gradually shape one's character. And this is why I said character becomes destiny, because character can influence life trajectory. Decisions come from our internal models of the world. So if someone's emotional patterns lead them to avoid opportunities or be distrustful of others, sabotage closeness, and expect rejection, those decisions will affect relationships, career, and overall life direction. That's why it can feel like emotions eventually shape destiny. It's not just mystical fate. It's the accumulation of thousands of small decisions driven by our behavioral patterns internally. However, it is important to note that patterns are not permanent. The brain constantly updates itself. So, when someone begins to notice and process emotions instead of suppressing them, the old patterns start to lose its strength and new reactions can form. That's why habits like reflection, therapy, journaling, or just simple honest acknowledgement of feelings can change long-standing behavioral loops. So in other words, what you practice repeatedly can become an identity, and what you bring into your awareness can also be rewritten. So while it is largely true that habit can become character and character can become destiny if you view it from a behavioral and psychological sense, but it's not absolute or irreversible. See, the habit becomes character and character becomes destiny is an idea that we can trace back to a very old philosophical observation, and which is often attributed to Aristotle. Aristotle argued that repeated actions shape who we become, and modern psychology and neuroscience actually supports much of that idea. Over time, those patterns start to look like personality traits or part of your character. So, for example, you know somebody who is a consistent practitioner of honesty. You know that everybody knows them to be a person of integrity. Somebody who's constantly avoiding responsibility, emotions, or hard conversations, they have the tendency to be passive, or they trend toward passivity. If you know somebody who's constantly harboring resentment, and they're the ones that you know to be the bitter type. But if you know somebody who's always very courageous, and they are they're constantly practicing that courage, they're always known to be resilient. At that point, we often say, oh, that's just how they are. But what we're not actually seeing is a long practice pattern. This is how character becomes destiny. So, personality traits, part of your character, it influences how a person interprets situations and what choices they make. Those choices begin to accumulate. Let's say, for example, someone who is habitually disciplined tends to follow through on opportunities. Somebody who's always scared and fearful, they will avoid risk and growth. Somebody who's known to be generous can build strong networks. And somebody who's always distrustful of anybody tend to isolate themselves. And over the years, those patterns shape the trajectory of relationships, career, health, and overall direction of their lives. So, in that sense, character strongly influences destiny because decisions compound over time. However, destiny is not locked. The key thing that is often left out of the quote is that habits can actually change because the brain remains plastic throughout life. So, a person who becomes aware of their patterns can interrupt them and create new ones. When habits shift, character also gradually shifts with them. So when character shifts, the direction of someone's life can shift as well. The idea that habits turn into character and character becomes destiny is mostly accurate, but it's better understood in this way. Habits shape character, and then character shapes decisions, and those decisions shape life's direction. Awareness of your habits is the beginning of change, because at that point, you now have the power to rewrite your life's direction.